Hello and welcome. At this very moment, an embargo has been broken. My name is Femi, okay?
I'm Achim Steiner.
And?
I'm Selim, Jahan.
Today we are talking about the Human Development Index and indices, the Statistical 2018 update. That last word, update, is very, very important because...
Since 1990, we have been producing the UN Human Development Report, and its story really began on the back of realizing that measuring development and human well-being just by measuring income per capita per head of population didn't tell you enough about whether development was happening. So we added education, we added life expectancy, and a number of other indices over the year. And since then, UNDP has been publishing this report every year, giving an analysis of how well are countries doing in terms of their development.
So you're very welcome wherever you're watching around the world. A couple of hashtags so that you can put your questions to us right here, right now. So ask UNDP, hashtag ask UNDP, hashtag Human Development Index, and also hashtag Data for Human Dev, DEV. So we're looking at this update. It's a release. The release is right now. People can go online and find it. Why is it important?
Well, in one sense, it's about addressing this issue of should development be about the lottery of life? If you're born the son or a daughter of a Norwegian couple and you will live as a result of that 82 years, you will have on average 18 years of schooling, or you're born the son and daughter maybe of a family in Niger. You will live 22 years less on average. You will only go to school on average for 5 years. Should that really be in the 21st century a matter of the lottery of life, or can we make development change these inequalities? First of all, among countries, and more importantly, as a report has also increasingly shown over the years, address inequality within countries. That's the power of using data to inform development.
And I think, you made a very strong point, because by giving the update, we are also giving a lot of information to the policymakers to do the policy shifts. I mean, you talked about Niger and you talked about another country where the life expectancy difference is quite large. So the policymakers in Niger will have to think that if this is the situation, what are the kind of the strategies that we can take?
If we go right down to basics, this idea of human development, what is it?
I think it's the freedom to have the opportunity to realize your potential. At the end of the day, you are born today in different parts of the world into settings where your whole life is already predetermined by the economic conditions, by the governance conditions. As Selim just pointed out, governments make choices. They make choices to provide education or not to provide education, to provide health insurance, health services. Development is all about giving people the opportunity to realize their potential. And sometimes we need help from the international community. Sometimes it is a matter of national government policy. Sometimes it's also a matter of how businesses and business leaders invest in their people, in their employees, in the families, in the communities in which they operate. And the human development indicators are, in a sense, holding up a mirror to the world and saying, this is how well we're doing. And here are not only the top performers or the bottom performers, because the bottom performers, not surprisingly, in this year's indices are again countries that are in conflict. War, civil strife is a terrible thing for development. But there are many countries, and I'm sure Selim will speak to some of them, that have actually made incredible leaps over the last year. And why is that happening, and what can we learn from that?
Selim, people are often quite obsessed about the rankings,
right,
where we are. Right. Where's my country in the rankings? 189 countries.
That's correct.
You look at?
Yes.
Okay, and there's the top and the bottom. Go and look at the update so you can see what's at the top. But for me, what I find intriguing are the countries that made the biggest leap. What does that tell us?
Okay, I think we have to distinguish between ranks and the values. And sometimes we are over-obsessed with ranks. Ranks can change because you are performing well, somebody else is performing better. And if you include countries in a HD table, then the ranks may change. For example, this year we have brought in Marshall Island. So that is the 189th country. As a result, any country after 106 rank has shifted one step down. Now, looking at the ranks, if we think of the ranks, then Ireland has jumped by 13 ranks between 2012 and 2017. Turkey, Botswana have jumped 8 ranks. But at the other end, you also have to think about countries which have lost ranks. I mean, Achim was mentioned about the conflicts and everything. I mean, Syria, Yemen, and Libya have lost ranks. Between 2012 and 2017, Syria has moved from medium human development to low human development.
All conflicts.
Yes.
Countries that are unstable.
Yes, exactly. I mean, the point we have to make, and we made it in the report, is that progress achieved is not progress guaranteed. Just because you have made progress, there may be shocks, vulnerabilities, and then you lose human development progress that you have achieved over time.
A lot of this is about future generations and making sure that they grow up in regions and countries that are doing better, doing well. Let's look at technology, Achim. If you took a child and said, these are the opportunities for you, how would you give us an example of that, and technologies and jobs and the potential?
Earlier this year, I traveled together with my colleague Mark Lowcock, who is the UN's Emergency Relief Coordinator, and we visited the Somali region of Ethiopia, and then we also went to Mogadishu. And just in the encounters I had on this visit, it became so glaringly obvious of how amazing it would be if we could connect some of the opportunities the world provides to some of the most desperate people. We were literally in the Somali region in an area where the pastoralist communities were living under a plastic sheet, being provided just with food and water supplies to survive from day to day. That baby born there is completely disconnected from the universe of Facebook, internet, Wi-Fi, and all of that. I traveled a couple of hours east. We went to Mogadishu, and I attended a training workshop in an innovation lab that we as UNDP run together with our colleagues from the Egypt office in Mogadishu to train young entrepreneurs on how to run businesses by developing their own applications. And to give you one fascinating example, hairdressers, an app that essentially would allow citizens to locate the hairdressers. Most of them are actually on bikes and moving around Mogadishu on the app, and connecting basically a market of everyone, because everybody needs to have a haircut at some point with a trade. And it's just a fantastic example of 21st century technology meets a young person who generally would feel that living in Mogadishu in the year 2018 is almost without hope.
We have been talking about this update, this release, how important it is, and been telling people, ask questions, ask UNDP. Benjamin Yo says, I think the HDI is brilliant. How do you see it potentially working alongside SDGs? And what are its strengths, and what would you hope to improve? So, Selim, how do you see it working alongside the SDGs?
I think the Human Development Index and all the indicators are complementary to SDGs in a number of ways. I mean, here we are assessing the progress of 189 countries on human development indicators, some of which are already in the SDGs. So this can provide you a kind of reservoir of data which you can use in monitoring the SDG progress. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. That's one. The second, I also think that the SDG indicators, some of them are not reflected in the human development indicators as yet. So therefore, we have to look at those indicators and also try to see how we can mobilize data so that we can also enrich our human development indicators. So I don't see any kind of a tension. Sometimes people think, well, human development indicators and SDG indicators, are they in tension? No. They can be complementary, they can actually enrich each other. Let me make one point. In 1990, there are only 130 countries which were included in the Human Development Report. Today we have 189. I mean, there have been additional 59 countries.
Do you go looking for extra countries?
Well, if the countries can come up with the data and which have been
that's
vindicated
really
by international agencies and UN sister agencies, of course we do that.
Which is partly what the SDGs are very much focusing also on. In order to leave no one behind, you have to know who you leave behind, and you have to apply the extraordinary power of data, increasing of artificial intelligence. So here the SDGs, with being supported by indicators and targets, governments have committed to reporting, also allows the Human Development Report to draw on a better age of data. But I think there's another dimension. Those of you who will know the Human Development Report will probably miss this year the chapters that normally go with this report. We have this year published the indicators and indices. We deliberately took a step back because we're all, in a sense, wondering what is happening to development, what is happening to the world. And we're also trying to rethink, how do we use the power of data that is growing exponentially every day, every month, in a different way to also inform development decision making. So we have joined up, for example, with the World Inequality Data Lab of Thomas Piketty and his network, to, over the next year, focus particularly on interrogating what do policymakers need to know about addressing inequality, because inequality throughout this report is standing out as tearing our societies apart. Wealthier societies, poorer societies. It's interesting, whether you're rich or in a higher category of human development or not, inequality, whether it is gender, whether it is by race, by ethnicity, is causing tremendous grief and pain. Development has to focus on this question of inequality. And you know, the power of the Human Development Report, back to Ben's point about it is brilliant, is that it has an extraordinary following. And it is downloaded over 120 million times every time it is launched. Since 1990, it has given rise to over 800 reports, because it's not just the global report. It then is used for regional human development reports, national ones, even at the level of city and municipalities, because it's a tool by which we can all have a conversation about how to tackle things that we simply know are bad for development.
I don't want to miss this, because sometimes we miss some good news because we're looking who's at the bottom. And the good news is, broadly speaking, the world is doing better. Better educated, living longer, more resources in terms of financial resources. That's the broad. That's not the headline, though. People don't tend to notice that, but that's really important. But the differences are the big difference between some people who are doing well and some people who are not doing so well. So that inequality gap is critical.
But let me just pick up on something, and Selim, maybe you can say a couple about the numbers. You know, development is often discussed today in terms of failure or lack of progress. I think people sometimes forget that we have managed in 300 years to develop in ways that allow us now to keep 7 billion people alive and fed and better off largely than we did 300 years ago when we were only 1 billion people on this planet. Secondly, about 200 years ago, 9 out of 10 people alive on this planet were living in extreme poverty. We've completely reversed that. Today it is 1 out of 10 who lives in extreme poverty. That's development. That is the extraordinary achievement of human ingenuity, of solidarity also, of helping one another. And these principles still apply to development today. And as you say, even the human development indices that we have, the last 8 years have seen a significant increase in the number of countries who are in the high and very high human development category. And we have also seen a significant reduction in the number of countries in the low human development category. So the underlying story of development is it's working. It's lifting hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. It's allowing us to live longer. It allows us to, you know, make sure that girls go to school and complete their schooling. For education, health service to be available to ever larger numbers of people. So this is also an antidote to those who think that engaging, investing in one another through international development cooperation and making the poor the focus of national policy is not a lost undertaking. On the contrary.
I think picking on Achim's point is that the progress we have made, we should celebrate. And if we look at the low human development countries, if I just take the number of people, I mean, in 1990, there are 2.4 billion people who are in low human development, which was about 60% of global population of 5 billion at that point in time. Today, it's only 926 out of 7.5 billion people. So I think this is progress. Let me make one point. When we talk about Sub-Saharan Africa, we often talk, well, things are not working in Sub-Saharan Africa, the progress has been slow and everything. Let us share some numbers. And I think in Sub-Saharan Africa, over the years, the 27 or 28 years, the HDI has progressed at the rate of 35%. I mean, it has increased by 35%, where the global HDI has just gone up by 22%. So that's progress. In the world, the gain in life expectancy of 11 years in Sub-Saharan Africa is the fastest compared to 7 years for the whole globe. We also know that in terms of schooling, they have made good progress. So I think the narrative about Sub-Saharan Africa needs to be changed.
And there are quite a number of countries in the very high human development category now.
Absolutely, the 4 of them actually, yes.
So if you just joined us, where have you been? But welcome. You can watch the tape a little bit later. We are talking about human development indices and indicators, and they've just been released by the UNDP. So not a brand new report, but an update. Where are we now? What is the biggest change, Selim, that you've seen from the last time you actually did a huge deep dive?
I think this year we have just updated the indicators and the data. I think three things came out quite strongly. One is, of course, the kind of the progress that Achim was mentioning, and also the deprivations, inequalities. That's a big story, definitely. The other one that I have just mentioned is that development achieved does not guarantee that it will continue. Development is not linear. And we have seen that in the 1990s when the havoc of HIV/AIDS have affected Sub-Saharan Africa. Now it's conflict. And tomorrow there may be climate change. I mean, there has been projections that if we don't deal with climate change right now, by 2030 there will be 100 million additional people would be pushed into extreme poverty. So those things, I think, provide us with a kind of a perspective where we have to take all those issues, the shocks and vulnerabilities into it. And the third thing that came out quite differently, and we highlighted it, is the progress that has been made in Sub-Saharan Africa. And the point is that if that progress can continue and can build on it, I think the whole question of the achieving the SDGs would not be a dream but a reality in future.
Selim, I like you to talk about the way that there's progress in Sub-Saharan Africa, because just looking at this update, who is not doing so well in terms of human development: Burundi, Chad, South Sudan, Central African Republic, Niger. That is depressing to see that. But you see the positive in that.
I always see the positive because I think Achim has also mentioned, even though Sub-Saharan Africa as a region is low human development, there are 12 countries which have moved to medium human development. There are 4 countries there which are actually in high human development, countries like Botswana, countries like Mauritius, countries like Seychelles. So I think they also play a kind of a role model to the other countries in that particular region.
What is the relationship between climate change and inequality? I know this is something that you care deeply about, as do I. If we're looking at a young person growing up now, and there's definitely a concern and possibly a danger about what will happen to our climate and our environment, I know you like to have real life examples of what that child may have to face. Share one with us.
It's a deeply disturbing relationship, and to put it very bluntly, the hotter the world becomes, the more those who we refer to as vulnerable or as the poor or as the more risk exposed, and that has to do with whether you are born in a country that perhaps has only 400 millimeters of rainfall and suddenly will have only 200 millimeters, whether you're living on a coastline, and as we sit here in New York City, just south of us, millions of people are suddenly experiencing one of the phenomena of global warming, which is more extreme weather events. They are terrifying and they are destructive to the extreme. Last year, the hurricane season in the Caribbean showed what can happen in 24 hours. An entire economy is wiped out, all the housing, all the infrastructure. So climate change and inequality are unfortunately 2 things in development that when they combine usually produce terrible consequences. And that is why, you know, when we talk about sustainable development goals, we talk about resilient development, we talk about climate change, these are not separate spheres. And part of the challenge of our generation is to live in an age where we are being reminded that we are not independent from nature and from how our ecosystems and our atmosphere works, but we do so at a time where we have more technology, more resources, more opportunities to act than ever before. And this is the promise of the SDGs. When, you know, the world met in 2015 in the General Assembly Hall here, the then Secretary General called it a sacred hall. It was the place where the world reflected on how it would live together in the 21st century. And much of that has to do with the development choices we make today, not tomorrow, not the next generation. And that's why the kind of things that we are presenting today, and we are debating every day also in the papers, in our communities, really matter, because these are choices that we can always look to others to make, but they actually begin with each one of us, wherever we may live.
Carolina Eklo, thanks for your question, Carolina. On Twitter, she's a background research assistant living in Sweden, and her question: what are the security risks induced by climate?
I think the security risks are high. One is that if we take security from a larger perspective, I think agriculture would be very much vulnerable, and for the income of the farmers, their livelihood would be very much insecure. That's one. There are new research that are coming up that because of the climate change, there will be health risks. We don't know the whole extent of it, but the scientists are saying that there will be health risks there. that is also a risk. Smaller countries like the Maldives are sinking, that is also a risk. So in terms of the risk, human security and the risk associated with it, we don't know the whole picture as yet. I mean, we just are trying to exploring where the risks should be coming from. And that is one of the vulnerabilities that the humanity will face, and that will affect the human development progress in many regions, in many countries, in many communities.
But it's also why the military and security and geosecurity establishments of the world are now increasingly looking to climate research and the development indices to recognize the enormous risks that arise from this. I mean, we have had more than once the Security Council now looking at climate change as a threat multiplier. Because there are always tensions. There's competition for resources. People are displaced. They have to cross borders. We are seeing that in unprecedented numbers right now due to conflict, but also increasingly due to environmental stress. That has a domino effect, and understanding quite how severe those consequences are for our mutual security, never mind our personal security, is becoming part of the conversation, in which perhaps sometimes the military leaders are looking at this with a clearer eye than perhaps politicians do.
So we have about 9 minutes left. So if you've been thinking about asking a question, now is a good time. You can hashtag AskUNDP, you can hashtag Data for Human Dev, and you can hashtag Human Development Index, and the team will be looking out for your questions. Get them in right now. We have one on Facebook from Mies van der Werf, and Mies says, how do you guarantee the quality of the data that's been gathered in developing countries? And he also wants to know, to what degree does the UN have any oversight about the information gathering process?
Yes, there's nothing called perfect data. And we are not living in a perfect world. And there are imperfections, definitely. But let us not make perfection, make it as a kind of a hostage to the good of humanity. At the country level, I think we depend on the data which come from the countries, because the countries are the mother of all data, and they provide them to the international organizations which standardize them. Because remember that in the Human Development Index, we put 189 countries, we rank them, we try to get the values of it. So therefore we standardize it, not we ourselves, but our sister agencies, the Bretton Woods institutions, and then we use it. Of course, data issue is a major issue, and as the SDG is showing, that it's a Herculean task for many statistical offices in different countries to gather those kind of data.
But I would start from the origins again of the Human Development Report, which was to overcome a very narrow view of human development related to income per capita. What we have done over the last 20-25 years is to open the aperture to deal with imperfect data, but by having more data points included in defining what is actually human development and success, I think we have made our understanding more resilient. But Mace is quite right. I mean, in many parts of the world, data collection is still either non-existent, it's an estimate, it's an approximation, but we are trying to help countries to understand where they're going with what they have and help them develop better data sets. So I think, as Selim says, the challenges should not hold us back from using the data, but I think there is a
it's not perfect.
Exactly.
Yeah. John, you must have been thinking what I was thinking at exactly the same time. John is on Facebook, John Hall, and he says, what does this data mean in terms of people's lives?
I think they tell you how you are doing in terms of life expectancy, in terms of achievement of education, in terms of mortality. So in terms of people's lives, it tries to provide a kind of a indication of the well-being. Is it comprehensive? No, we are not covering every aspect of human life, of course not. There may not be quantitative data, but what we are trying to cover from the quantitative point of view, looking at some of the well-being issues. But in the report, there are also tables on the perceptions of well-being, how people perceive it. And these are the qualitative statements that people make. And I think one of the challenge for us is to look at the quantitative data and the perceptions of people. If they go together, that's fine.
And data makes things more visible. And one thing is to describe a phenomenon that I might see as I drive along a road, or that I perceive in terms of how I see poverty in my own community. The next step has to be data makes things visible in one sense. It doesn't make the individual visible, and that's why it's always important in development to remember that. But you know, the origins of this report again lay in leading world economists like Amartya Sen and Mahbub al-Haq, and later on also Kofi Annan, in trying to look at the future role of the UN in development, using that phrase from the Charter, in larger freedom. Data does not replace individual human lives. It allows us to see better, and the human development indices are essentially about this idea that we need to create opportunity for everyone. It's in larger freedom that we use data.
Gentlemen, we cannot not mention gender because always important, but probably more so now in this time than any other time. And we are seeing obviously inequalities in data for the difference between how women are doing and how men are doing in exactly the same countries. Selim.
Well, I think gender equality is one of the fundamental dimensions of human development. You cannot talk about human development just bypassing half of humanity. So from that perspective, we always have disaggregated data between men and women. But since you have brought the issue of gender, I think it should be looked at from two angles. One is that the relative position of women, or the relative discrimination of women vis-a-vis men. But the other one is that the absolute disadvantage that women face just because of their sex. Now, on the first issue, I mean, we have provided the Gender Development Index there, the Human Development Index for men, and Human Development Index for women.
So, do you want to give us one example? Because I think people watching will say, well, that's obvious.
Yes.
That there is an inequality and there's a gender gap.
Right.
Give us one example where you can say, this is what's happening to women, this is what's happening to men.
Okay. So one example, if you take the labor force participation rate, then you will see that the labor force participation rate of men is 75%, for women it is 49%. If you take the representation of women in parliaments, globally, it's still 23%.
23% around the world.
Around the world. Even
Female
Rwanda has achieved 68%, I mean, in terms of...
There are outliers that are
there's
positive
outliers
and
there,
others.
but that's the kind of the situation.
Right.
But on the second point, where they have disadvantages because they are women, I mean, we talk about the violence against women, the domestic violence. Every one woman out of 3 have been victims of violence in some sort of
And also what I noticed about domestic violence and the way that you were trying to report it was you didn't have enough information.
Absolutely.
So that's the downside or the negative side, or you rely on the countries to give you that information.
True, but when you have the double dots, as I say it,
that
also forces countries to get data.
Well, and countries themselves are becoming aware of this. I was in Argentina a few months ago with the Minister of Justice, and I was amazed because in his office he had about 10 TV screens. A new electoral portal reform had allowed people all over the country now to access e-government centers and report violence against women locally, and to be able to get an idea at central government level, where do we need to focus, where is it worst, why do we have these phenomena. So we come back to data, we come back to e-government platforms, and this is part of UNDP's work, helping governments to use data better, more effectively through their institutions, through new platforms, new technologies, and hopefully in that sense contribute to addressing some of the outliers here. And I hope particularly for young people, it's a chance to also say to their leaders, why are we in this slot in the human development indices, and why are we not here? And not necessarily the overall rank. You raise gender inequality, a lot of countries drop in the ratings because of the inequality. This is the difference of the human development indices. It's not because you have a certain amount of per capita income. We then look at education, we look at gender, and you drop quite a long way. A lot of countries come down in the rankings because of inequality.
Is this a top tip for the next one? Not that it should be competition. More gender equality, you might actually rank a little bit higher.
Of course.
All right, let's. We are live right now. We're on Facebook, we're on Twitter, we're on Instagram, on YouTube. Actually, wherever UNDP is, that is where we are right now. Karuba Kathy is on Facebook and asks, how can young people meaningfully hold leaders accountable to international agreements? If you knew that answer, you would probably both be joint Secretary General of the UN.
Well, we have a fantastic boss.
Good, that is a great question. And is there any connection between what we're talking about now and also holding political leaders and making them accountable?
Let me just say to those of you who want to get some inspiration, have a look at Secretary General Antonio Guterres' speech on climate change a couple of days ago. That was his clarion call to world leaders, but world leaders not just being heads of government or CEOs of corporations, leaders in communities, in families, in community groups, in places of employment. International agreements are a commitment. Accountability essentially happens when people in a country, in a community say to their leaders, what are you doing to make this happen? I would urge, for example, everyone in their country to ask their leaders, what are we doing about our national climate change strategy? We all signed up to the Paris Agreement. What is happening in my country? Because there's an extraordinary amount happening, and at the same time we all know it's not yet enough. That's where we need young people to get on the street and into meetings and into the media and challenge us.
I'm really glad you said that, because Kathy Karubo also wanted to know, how can young people lead sustainable development?
Yeah, I think I pick up the last point Achim has mentioned, the streets. I mean, sometimes young people, and we all write on Facebooks, on social media, and think that our responsibilities have been done. But I think it is also important to be on the street, to have a kind of a social movement, and they'll hold them accountable. I think the younger people can really lead sustainable development by being innovative, by being entrepreneurial at one end, and on the other hand, actually starting a kind of a movement to create that kind of the awareness, and also holding leaders accountable. Because in many countries, the larger population are below 24 now. And I think these are the future leaders also. So I think there should be a multi-pronged approach to that, but not forgetting their own responsibility.
And we can help. I mean, in the UN family, we have literally thousands of points of collaboration, from UNICEF to UNDP, UNFPA, WHO, ILO. We are working with young people, and sometimes the leadership also comes from within countries. In Rwanda, Youth Connect is an amazing initiative to connect entrepreneurs who can mentor young people. It's now an initiative that is rolling out across Africa. We are proud partners of that. Sometimes we follow leaders also, because they are actually pointing the way, but they need our engagement.
Achim, before you joined the UNDP, did you actually read the Human Development Index?
Yes, I read the Human Development
You didn't even pause then.
No, I did, because you know, in the development field, the extraordinary thing about the UN Human Development Report is it's a little bit like your annual reality check. So since 1990, when it began, it has been a reminder that whatever we might declare we want to do, this is actually what's happening in the world. So in that sense, it's extremely important. Second, it very often set a different process of thinking about what needs to happen next, where do we need to focus on. And again, deliberately this year, we took a little break, because we said there is so much happening, and in some ways we need to learn and relearn what happens next, because the world is changing so rapidly that next year, look forward to the UN Human Development Report, because it will, I think, send a signal about where countries are likely to head.
He not only read, actually he once signed the foreword of one report, 2007 and 2008, on climate change, along with Kemal Dervish, who was the administrator.
It's the only time UNDP allowed another UN head to co-sign a foreword. So you see, my dedication was
You're very dedicated.
destiny.
All right. Meaningful World, hello, on Facebook. Thank you for following. Asks, what are the dangers of focusing only on income to measure development?
I think income is unidimensional, and income is not the sum total of human life. We always use a phrase saying that the Human Development Index is as vulgar as GDP per capita, but it is not as blind as GDP per capita to the broader aspects of human development or human life. So focusing on income only would actually take your attention away from other aspects of life and other aspects of human well-being who may not be connected to income. Take a person who is basically belong to the lower caste in India or Nepal, may be very rich, but then there are certain restrictions on that particular person where he cannot exercise his choice or the freedoms that you have just mentioned. He may not be allowed to participate in certain social functions. He may not be allowed to go to certain churches or certain temples. So therefore, I think if we want to have a more comprehensive view of human well-being, you have to go beyond income.
What is the best use of the Human Development Report that you have seen or heard or you know about, where a country or an organization has taken it and really used it?
Well, I think my predecessors as administrator have often lived through this shock period after the launch of the report, because those countries that have either gone down in the index or appear somewhere low in the index sometimes react very angrily. And rarely has it been a matter that the data was wrong, but the perception within the country of where they should be and where reality in comparison actually pointing to show that there is a great contrast. And out of that have arisen extraordinary conversations, sometimes between the UN and that country, but more importantly in the public, because the media begins to discuss, people start to ask questions, parliament start to debate it. So the UN Human Development Report should never be a kind of raised finger pointing at anyone. It's actually, as I say, it's a mirror. Use it, because what it actually gives you is an approximation of reality that will help you. And in that sense, it's meant to empower debate and reflection. And for us, and that's been the second great benefit of the Human Development Report, is it has significantly shifted how international development cooperation has changed its focus from narrow economic infrastructure focused development to investing in people, in communities, and out of that come inspirational policy innovations such as Bhutan's Gross National Happiness Index.
Correct.
People laughed about that 15 years ago. Today it is increasingly informing us, because people don't just want to be wealthy, they actually want to be happy, and not in a kind of hedonistic sense. Happiness has something to do with being able to look after your children, to be able to guarantee them that they have an education. It's about knowing that in your old age you're not going to live in destitution. All of these things shape our lives, and again, in larger freedom. We want people to have the opportunity to make development work for them.
So what you just said, and Selim, I want to ask you this as well.
Sure.
There are so many indexes, reports, releases. How does this one even stand out, or is special, or this should be the go-to? Because there are so many, and then you look at the SDGs, and goodness me, so many indices there as well. How do people even keep up?
I think it's a question of different indices look at different aspects of human life. It's not that there may be some overlaps, but there's different ways of looking at human well-being, for example. The HDI has been in the business for the longest period of time, 27 years. And I think this was the first one where it looked at the broader aspects of human life. I mean, building on what Achim has said, 800 human development reports at the national, subnational, and even at the district level. One of them was in Egypt, and when they disaggregated the data, and that's the power of HDI, it basically has shown the kind of the disparities between Upper Egypt and the Lower Egypt, between Cairo and the rest of it. It started a discussion among the governors of 17 governorates, and it changed the resource allocation at that point in time. In many ways, the HDI is a mirror, I mean, to borrow your phrase, is a mirror where you can see how the different parts of the country are doing, how the groups are country, and that gives you a kind of a signal where to take action and how to take action. And that, I think, is one of the major strengths of the Human Development Index.
What would you want to do better with this update on the General Human Development Report? Where would you want to take it? What's the next level?
I think one is to harness the extraordinary power of data, of automation, of artificial intelligence. We are living through an age in which the amount of information that we will actually have at our disposal to better understand where are the poor and where are those who are left behind. We also have a group in our community that we often refer to the disabled people, the disability community, and that's roughly 10% of our community worldwide. How do we identify where they are? How can we make them much more actively engaged in the process of development? Because otherwise we overlook them. So that's one thing, the power of data, finding people where they are, being able to direct the right development responses. And here comes really the challenge of our time. We are going to experience in the next 10 to 20 years the most profound transformations, transitions, disruptions, technology, climate change, migration. I mean, we are not in a position right now to look forward to the next 10 or 20 years by sitting back and saying we know what to do. The Human Development Report is the world's most powerful platform on which to think about the future of development. And that is an extraordinary responsibility for UNDP, but also an extraordinary platform and invitation to the world. And that's why we are rethinking both the data as we want to evolve it and the indices, but also how can the report recreate those moments over the last 25 years when the whole world suddenly took this report and said, yes, this is a moment where we have to rethink and refocus perhaps what we do. That, I think, is the aspiration, and the world will judge us every year on whether the report lives up to it.
On that note, I can't think of a better way to wrap up. If you've been watching online and following online, thank you very much. You can still hashtag AskUNDP. They're always available to you 24/7. I'm just giving your staff lots of things to do. Selim Jahan is the Human Development Report Office Director. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
And Achim Steiner, the Administrator of the UNDP. Thank you very much. What an interesting way to talk about a release that isn't loads of paper, and so that you can get an insight into it and then go and download it and read it for yourself.
Thank you, Femi.
Gentlemen, thank you.
Thank you, Femi.
Thank you.
you.